Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you today, and as always, by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I hope you are having a wonderful Thursday. Did you eat pie yesterday? It was Pie Day, 314. I had no pie. It was a very sad pieless day for me, but that's okay. Probably, the healthy things I ate instead were probably better for me, just not nearly as fun. Oh well, anyway, yesterday was Pie Day, today is another episode, and I am happy to bring you another author interview and another book giveaway. Yes, that's two this week. We won't always have giveaways with every interview going forward, but there's going to be a lot of them, so make sure you stay tuned to the end to hear how you can be eligible to receive a free copy of the book that we're talking about today. That book is Bridge Daughter, and it is by author Jim Nelson. He is the author that I am speaking with today. Bridge Daughter is maybe one of the most unique concepts I've encountered in a long time. I read the back of the book when I first got it and thought, wow, where did he come up with this idea? And in the process, even before I started reading it, I was telling people about it, my parents, my husband, friends, that because it was just such a unique concept. I was like, you've got to hear about this author that I'm going to have on the podcast. This is what his book is about. And so I kept telling them, and they had kind of the same reaction that I did. That is fascinating. Where on earth did he come up with that? So let me give you the description from the back of the book so that you can find out why I think this is so fascinating. And that description is as follows. Young Hanna thinks her 13th birthday will be no different than the one before, until her mother explains the facts of life. Hanna is a bridge daughter, born pregnant with her parents' child. In a few months, she will give birth and die, leaving her parents with their true daughter. A mature bookworm who dreams of college and career, Hanna is determined to overcome her biological fate. Navigating through a world eerily like our own, she confronts unyielding attitudes and instinctive fears as old as humankind itself. Then Hanna learns of an illegal procedure that will allow her to live to adulthood, at the cost of the child's life. So, hopefully that intrigued you as much as it intrigued me when I read it, because I knew I had to read this book, and once I started, I was sucked in. This is a very compelling story. And I was actually, on a slight side note, I'm kind of fascinated how the schedule comes together, because if you listen to Tuesday's podcast, we have very similar and very dissimilar books and heroines this week. We have books that fall into the category of fantasy/science fiction. We have young women who are the heroines of those books. Both of the heroines in these books love books. They themselves are avid readers and love to get lost in stories and have a deep respect for books, which I appreciate. Both find themselves in situations that they did not expect and were not quite prepared to deal with. So in some ways, they're very similar heroines, right? But in other ways, completely different. Obviously, Hanna is much, much different than Callie from Tuesday's interview. But it's just amazing that I ended up having two young adult books, both in that fantasy science fiction genre, both of these strong, interesting heroines and these fascinating concepts. So that's my side note. But Hanna is such a compelling character, and her story is so compelling. I don't want to give too much away because there's a lot in this book that you'll want to read for yourself, and you'll want to hear Jim talk about it. So rather than me continuing to babble on, I will just say I was sucked in pretty much from the beginning of this book. I had to read through it to find out what was going to happen with Hanna, what decision she was going to make, how she was going to navigate this news, etc. And she is such an interesting character in such a unique situation. So for that alone, you should definitely be interested in this book. But let's turn to that interview with Jim Nelson and hear what he has to say about the story, his inspiration for it, etc. So here is my interview with Jim Nelson, author of Bridge Daughter. Hi, Jim. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. So before we get to talking about your book, Bridge Daughter, I would love for my listeners to get to know you a little bit. So just if you could share a little bit about yourself, whatever you're comfortable with, that would be great.
Sure. Well, I was born and raised in the Bay Area, and the book does take place in the East Bay and San Francisco. So it's sort of my this is my home. This is the area I've been raised in. I grew up in a suburban household environment. My parents were both farm kids from the Midwest that moved to California a long time ago. And I've wanted to be a writer since I was a child. My mother worked for a children's book company. I'll just name it Scholastic.
Oh, wow.
Most people are familiar with them. That she worked in one of the distribution warehouses. And so every day or every week, she'd bring home remaindered books for me, and I was one of these kids that just everything she brought home I read.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
that's
awesome.
It just sort of naturally developed into me wanting to write books, but I didn't pursue it as a profession. I also, living close to Silicon Valley, I developed a affinity for computers, and that's been my professional pursuit is software engineering. So I've worked in and out of the computer field for since I was a young adult, and have been writing one way or another that whole time, and got serious about it in about 15 years ago. I left the profession, went back to school, got my degree in English and in creative writing, and I'm now trying to sort of balance between the both of them.
Okay. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. So talk to us about the book Bridge Daughter.
Sure. So Bridge Daughter is a book about a young girl who's on her 13th birthday is sort of anxious to know, she's anxious about her future. She wants to go to college, she has big plans, and she discovers, or it's announced to her on her 13th birthday, she discovers it by accident, that she is in fact a bridge daughter, which means that she was born pregnant with her parents' child, and she has been carrying that child her entire life, and that in a few months she will give birth and die, and that child will then become their real child, so to speak. So it's an alternate world. Sometimes it's described as dystopian. Otherwise, though, the world looks exactly like ours. It's not like it's a different planet or there's some exotic technology. It actually takes place in our past. It's set in 1983.
Thank you. I was going to ask that.
So, yeah, it's not laid out specifically in the book. It's just sort of implied that there's no internet, there's no cell phone. But otherwise, it's the world we live in, except for this one biological difference. And there's this entire culture about bridge daughters that has developed over hundreds of thousands of years. They stay at home. They don't go to school. They're not allowed to learn to read or write or carry or handle money. They're supposed to wear a particular dress or a particular uniform to identify them in public. And the parents of this particular bridge daughter chose to sort of go their own way. They homeschooled their bridge daughter. They raised her as if she was normal. She wasn't assigned the household chores that the other bridge daughters are. And so this is all a big surprise to the girl when she finds out about this. So the story is about her trying to deal with this and trying to find a way that she could avoid dying. She has big hopes, whereas the other bridge daughters tend to be either in the dark or they've just sort of resigned to their fate.
Yeah, and I've talked to several people, several friends and family members this week about this story because it's a pretty unique concept, and so I've been telling them about it. Where did this idea come from?
Yeah, I get asked this because it's a little grim, it's morbid, and trust me, it's unusual even for me. This was a real break for me. I've never written a story from the point of view of a woman, and this is certainly the first time I've ever written anything from the point of view of a 13-year-old girl. I'll just reveal that I'm childless. I'm married, but I have no children. My brother has 4 girls, and that's sort of been an influence in my life, but from a distance. This all came about it was a combination of things. As an aside, I believe that inspiration is never just one idea comes into your head. It's usually like 3 or 4 things sort of connect in a way that's unique. I had been meaning for years to write a sort of a children's book for my brother's daughters. I thought I grew up, as I mentioned, on scholastic books, and I wanted to write a book like I had experienced when I was young. And so I sort of had this idea about writing a book from a perspective of a 13-year-old girl for them, and that she was sort of bookish and eager to go to college and smart but shy. And I never really found a way to develop that into anything interesting. I never really came up with anything like an angle that I was happy with. And it was quite literally one morning I woke up out of a dream, and I don't remember the dream, but I woke up and I had this idea in my head, this strange idea about a world of this odd reproductive system. And the more I thought about it, the more excited I got about it. And I started writing it that day, in fact. I woke up and it was my day off, and I just sat down at the computer and banged out a first chapter. And I knew at that point that this was something I had to finish.
So when it comes to, because really the world is pretty much exactly the same, except for this one very strange detail in terms of bridge daughters. Did you feel like you needed to do any research on biology or anything, or was that aspect of the book mainly of your own making?
No, I did do some research. I wouldn't say I was. I don't want to give people the picture of me like at the library for 2 weeks hunkering down in biology books. But I used the internet. I did what everyone would do. I went to the internet and I did some research on not extensive research, but just ideas on. First of all, I wanted to know if this was something that ever even happened. And it turns out I must have read about this years before, but there are certain insects where this kind of biology, this reproduction occurs. Obviously, doesn't happen in mammals, and I would never purport that this is something that could be easily taught or anything like that, or happen. But I did do a little research. I also had a friend I have a friend who's a biologist, and we have talked a long time about evolution and what that entails and implies, and that sort of fed into the book. There's discussion in the book about the biology and where it comes from. And actually, more of the research was not so much on the biology, but thinking about surrogacy and reading up about different issues surrounding surrogate parents and some of the tensions between a surrogate and the couple who are waiting for their child. And I realized that this was kind of a similar situation, except that instead of the surrogate being an adult woman, it's a child. And, children and all their foibles. It's this, you've got this little human being living with you, and you're anxious about their every move, because if they fall down, if they catch a bad disease, what's going to happen? And that was really interesting, was to learn about surrogacy. And then finally, I went looking around for story ideas, and not story ideas, but the past, the history of surrogacy. And of course, I landed immediately on Hagar in the Bible, and I realized I had to work that into the story somehow.
I am going to jump in here now so we can take our first break of the podcast. But there you have Jim's explanation and description of Bridge Daughter. So when we come back, we'll be talking more about that book as well as a little bit about the sequel or the next book in the series, Hagar's Mother. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and we will be right back.
Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with Jim Nelson, author of Bridge Daughter. And before the break, he had just described the story, and now we're going to talk a little bit more about that and then look at his follow-up book, Hagar's Mother. So let's get back to that interview with Jim Nelson. And yeah, it's just this interesting, kind of fascinating concept because the woman gives birth to a daughter that then lives with them for 13 or 14 years. You raise her, the parents raise her, but she's not their real child. She's carrying their real child. And they know at some point that this child will be gone and their real child will appear. I can't quite fathom. I have a 12-year-old niece and a 14-year-old niece, and I just can't quite fathom having lived with them for all of these years and knowing that they were soon going to die. So it's a fascinating book. So talk a little bit more about Hanna, who is the main character.
Oh, sure. Hanna is, she's a fictional character, but yeah, as a writer, I kind of fell in love with her as I kept writing into her. She's as I said, she's a bookworm. She's the kind of girl that when she hears a word she doesn't know, she goes home and looks it up in the dictionary. She loves flowers. That was another thing. Actually, I had to do some research on that because I don't know anything about flowers, but I come up with this idea that she loves flowers, and she has this idea in her head that maybe when I grow up, I'll be a florist or I'll be a horticulturist. And so she loves going to flower shops, and she loves arranging flowers. And her uncle his girlfriend is Japanese American, and she teaches Hanna how to make the origami crane, and that plays a role in the book as well. So she's sort of this girl that she has it's something that I noticed in my nieces. They constantly have new interests. There's always something new. I go over one time and one of them is into dinosaurs, and then the next time I go over and she wants to play the drums, and and I wanted to capture some of that sort of vivid interest in a wide range of activities, and the way that children, especially at that age, are always thinking like, what am I going to be when I grow up? What am I going to be when I grow up? And so it kind of, the story kind of pulls the rug out from underneath Hanna. I like to believe that Hanna is a character that has some grace, that she doesn't react in a negative way to this news, that she tries to find a way to move forward with some dignity, and I think that's what makes her heroic, even though she's in a very difficult spot.
Yeah, she really does struggle with a lot of the morality issues. I mean, she does do the typical kind of 13-year-old reaction of this isn't fair, which she's exactly right about. But
right.
She really does try to see it from as many angles as possible, which is pretty impressive. So there is a sequel to this book Right, Hagar's mother. And
That's correct.
I don't want to give away the ending of Bridge Daughter, but can you talk a little bit about Hagar's mother without giving away the ending of Bridge Daughter?
Sure. So Hagar's mother takes place 30 years later in 2013. And again, the world is very similar to ours. They have the internet, they have mobile phones, and it takes place again in the East Bay and the North Bay, actually. This is set, again, with the same family, but the book is told from the perspective of the mother, or a mother in this situation. So in the Bridge Daughter, it's told from the point of view of Hanna, and her mother is a very strong second character. Obviously, she's constantly worried about Hanna and sort of trying to see her interests. In the second book, it's told from the point of view of a mother who has twin bridge daughters. This is told from the point of view of the parent and her concerns about this. It's not. What I try to tell people is it's not a tightly woven sequel. It's not like some of the series that are out there where it's the action stops on end of book one and the action picks up on book two. They're loosely connected. You could read the second book before you read the first book. I wouldn't recommend it. I think it's probably better to read the books in order, but it does make reference to the first book. But it's the characters and their issues and what they're going through are sort of problems unto themselves. And the book also talks more about the history of Bridge Daughters, and in particular, it focuses on the different ways that Bridge Daughters have tried to escape their fate, and the way that certain adults have attempted to help them. So it kind of expands the world a little bit, and it continues the story.
Right. So this just brings up all kinds of questions for me that in terms of you give birth to twins who are pregnant with your twins who are their genetic doubles, but they wouldn't necessarily have those babies at the same time. So are they still technically twins? Right. My brain just went into about 6 different directions.
Yeah, what I didn't mention before is, and this is important, is that when the Bridge Daughter gives birth, they're the child they're holding is a clone, essentially. It's the genetic identical, or there's a phrase I use in the book, a genetic double is a good phrase. I think genetic identical or something like that. Yeah. No, you know what? I would love to tell you that I have all the biology worked out. It's all straight in my head, but I'll tell you, I would just say, don't ask too many questions.
No, that's one of those that you just kind of have to go with it.
Yeah, I think actually, though, if you follow the DNA closely, yes, even though the twins would give birth at different times, the children they give birth to are twins. It's also important to realize that I do play a little fast and loose in another way, which is the Bridge Daughter can give birth to a boy, and obviously a boy is not a genetic duplicate of the Bridge Daughter. So, I mean, I'm the first to confess I'm a little fast and loose with the genetic stuff. But to me, what's important is not so much the genetics as the questions that are being asked.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the experience that the reader has to think about.
Okay. Is this going to be a series? Will there be more books?
Yeah, I have a third book in store. This will actually go back in time. There's a grandmother that is mentioned prominently in both books, and it'll be her story. It'll start in 1933, I think is what I've got it sort of pegged to start, but mostly take place in the 40s and 50s, and it's about her raising her own Bridge Daughters out in the North Bay. I don't have it all planned out quite yet, but I've got a really good idea of where I want to go with it. And so the books kind of link up and make like a circle, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. This is a little bit random, but on the cover of Bridge Daughter, it says that it is by Jim Nelson, who is the author of, what is it? Edward Teller dreams of barbecuing people. So does he dream of actually people who are barbecuing, or
No.
barbecuing actual people?
No, that's a very different book. I've written a book before, Bridge Daughter, and it's based. When I say I grew up in the East Bay, I grew up in Livermore, California. Livermore is home of one of the country's 2 top nuclear weapon development centers, the other being Los Alamos in New Mexico. My parents did not work there, but I had a lot of friends whose parents worked at the lab, as we called it, and many of them were working on hydrogen bombs and thermonuclear weapons and things like that, and it was all very hush-hush. But we all knew what was going on out there. And then when I was growing up in the 80s, to sort of date myself, I was a teenager, the Livermore lab was working on the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was a project that Ronald Reagan announced to have satellites in orbit that would stop the Soviets from launching a nuclear attack. And some of my friends' fathers were working on that. So I took just a bunch of, it's not autobiographical, but I took some elements from my teenage years and wrote a very tongue-in-cheek story about growing up in California suburbia, where all of the adults are working on, either the end of the world or stopping the end of the world, and it's sort of in the vein of it's a Cold War novel, but it was written after the Cold War, obviously. And so Edward Teller was the founder of the Livermore Lab, and the reference to barbecuing is not about nuclear war. It's a reference to all the time I spent next to a pool, someone barbecuing chicken or hamburgers, and just it was one of those childhoods where when I left Livermore, it wasn't until a few years later that I said, that was really weird. Like, that's not something that many
Right.
people experience, but I just grew up with it and I just took it for granted. I just assumed that everyone had friends whose fathers had 3 PhDs from Ivy League schools and understood the intricacies of, I read an interview once with it was the son of Dr. Feynman, who was another famous physicist, and he talked about going out into the backyard with his father and doing all kinds of strange experiments and not realizing until years later that, other kids don't do this, And so that's what that book's about. But it's a very different book and more tongue-in-cheek, more humorous.
Right. I just had to ask because between the name of that book and the concept of Bridge Daughter, I was very curious about what your brain was like. And it sounds like a fascinating place. So you said that...
I'm a Capricorn, so people say that makes me a very dark person. So
okay.
I guess so.
Well, that explains it. Thank you. You said that you grew up wanting to write. Do you have advice for other aspiring authors?
I would say a couple things. I'd say one, just keep at it. When I say I've been writing most of my life, I mean, I really mean that. And I don't mean that I was writing every day my entire life, but I was certainly writing actively. I used to write blogs. I used to have a website where I was actively writing sort of articles or essays. I still do on my blog today. Keep at it. Seek out other writers in your community. Just try to find writing groups you can join or take classes. And most of all, know that you're in a very good time. When I was trying to get published 20 years ago, it was not easy. It was quite difficult. You really had these gatekeepers, these publishing houses that were very very hard to get into. And today, with electronic books, ebook publishing, there's a whole new set of opportunities. There's a whole set of independent publishers who can make it very easy, make it much easier to get your work out there because the outlay is much lower. And even look into independent publishing yourself. There's nothing wrong with that. It's actually a healthy way to get started. Bridge Daughter was published by Amazon. They have a program called Kindle Scout, and if you're not aware of it, public writers need to know about it. It gives you a chance to put your work out there. People vote on reading. They read the first three chapters of your story or so, and they can vote on it. And Kindle Press, if they like it, will publish it. It's certainly something to look into.
Yeah, we've had at least one, I think 2 other authors who have gone that route. So, yeah, it's definitely a good option.
Yeah, it's just something to at least be aware of, depending on the kind of book you're trying to write.
Mm-hmm. Jumping in here once again so we can take our second break of the podcast. But Kindle Scout is pretty interesting. If you remember from Tuesday's interview, Louise's book, The On Holy Ground, is currently up on Kindle Scout. So a reminder that you can look at the first 3 chapters of that. We've had other authors who have gone that route and have been published through Kindle Scout. So it's definitely an interesting concept. I hadn't heard about it until authors started telling me about it on this podcast. So definitely something you should check out if you are interested in new books and want to have a little bit of influence in which books might get published. You should go onto Kindle Scout, you should go to their page and read some of the chapters that are up there and, find one that you like and see if it gets published. So we are going to take that second break. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and we'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and here is the conclusion to my interview with author Jim Nelson. When you read, and most authors are pretty avid readers, do you have favorite authors or favorite genres?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm a huge fan of the hard-boiled fiction school. Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett, James Cain, Jim Thompson. Those are writers that I've returned to for decades now. I don't tend to write that kind of fiction, but I really appreciate their style and their use of language, and just the subject matter is fun. Other writers that I enjoy I tend to read. I should say I tend to read older work and not so much new work. I've read some. I'm just blanking on B. Traven, who wrote the Treasure This Year, Madre, is another writer I've been getting into as well. And actually, the past few years, I've started reading Japanese manga. Not the high school. I should put this out there. Not the high school manga, kids and dating and all that. But there are more adult forms that are really interesting, and they're being translated into English by Drawn and Quarterly and some other publishers that I've also learned to enjoy, and I can see they've had some influence on my writing. And I should say that I've been writing on my blog, on my website. I've been writing about these different authors that I enjoy. Every few months, I'll pick one writer that I like and a book that's sort of representative of their work, and I'll write about them.
Okay. Thank you. Speaking of your blog and your website, can you tell people where they can find you on the internet?
Sure. Probably the easiest thing to do would be to go to my website, and it's j-nelson.net. And then from there are links to my Facebook page and my Twitter page. And then on my website, there are pages for each of the books that are out there, as well as a blog where I've been writing about not just my own books, but also about other books that I enjoy. And yeah, it would be great if people could check it out. And if you feel like joining the Facebook page, that's a good way to learn about when my next books come out.
Mm-hmm. How about things like Goodreads or BookBub? Are you on there for reviews and such?
I am. I'm on Goodreads and BookBub. There's I don't have the URLs in front of me. Probably saying the URLs is not the way to go.
I will actually include
on
those
my website
in the blog, the blog that goes with this episode. So those will be on there.
Oh, great. Well, then I'll make sure you get them. Yeah, I have a BookBub page. I have a Goodreads page. I have an Amazon author. Basically, every time I see any place where I can sign up, I do. So, and yeah, I have that all. On my website. There's like an about page that you can find from the top level menu, and it has links to all of my places on the internet that I have and maintain.
Okay, perfect. And then I have one other follow-up question that occurred to me that I should have asked you more toward the beginning, but have your nieces read Bridge-Daughter, and what did they think?
They have, actually, and I was very pleased. I had said earlier that I sort of started with this idea of writing a book for them. I did not intend for them to read Bridge-Daughter, because once I'd written the book, I realized it was so grim and morbid. I was like, oh my gosh, I don't want to turn off your readers. I think it's not grim and morbid. I'm being tongue in cheek, but
right.
These are my nieces, and I was sort of like, gee, I don't, it's not exactly, one of them was 8 years old when it came out, so I was a little worried about her reading it. But the older ones read it and they enjoyed it. They next time I saw them, they had some questions for me. They wanted to talk about the ending, which I won't talk about here. And I remember the third of the four, the third oldest, saying, "When's the next book coming out?" Which, of course, is everything I wanted to hear. So I don't know if they've read Hagar's Mother yet, but I hope they do.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing I should mention too is that some of the women in this book are based on the women in my family. My mother and my grandmother in particular were very, very strong women. That was very much an influence in my life, and I'm hoping that my nieces recognize some of that.
Great, thank you for that. I appreciate it. Is there anything else as we are wrapping up that we haven't covered that you would like for people to know about either your writing or your books, or anything that we haven't covered?
Well, I would mention one more thing that I'm working on. Even though I have a third book planned for this series on Bridge-Daughter, I wanted to step aside from it for one book because I'd sort of gone that I'd been written those two books straight back to back, and I needed to take a little break. So I'm working on another book right now. I mentioned Hard-Boiled Writers, which I like. It's actually a futuristic detective novel that I'm working on. It takes place in San Francisco, and it's about the future of the internet and a crime that occurs regarding the internet. And this detective is in San Francisco trying to find out who has done what, and of course there's murders and extortion and such. So it's a fun book, and I'm really enjoying writing it.
Oh, good.
And I'm hoping to have that out by the end of the year. And then once I finish that, I'll go right back to Bridge-Daughter. So
I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. I really enjoyed the book. You said earlier it's kind of grim, and it has aspects of that, but it's really fascinating. I mean, I read straight through it. I mean, I just wanted to find out what was going to happen, and I was rooting for Hanna so much, and I just needed to know. So it's very compelling. Thank you for that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate those kind words. Those are exactly the kind of things that I love to hear. So thank you.
Yeah. And like I said, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome. Once again, I want to thank my guest, Jim Nelson, for taking the time to speak with me today about his books, Bridge Daughter and Hagar's Mother. As I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, if you are interested in Bridge Daughter, and it is a very good, very interesting book, you have an opportunity to win a free copy. I have 3 copies to give away. Thank you, Jim, for those. So all you have to do is go onto social media, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, and either share the post on Facebook, share the episode post on Facebook, or the episode post retweeted on Twitter, or comment on the Instagram post, and you will be automatically entered to win a free copy of Bridge Daughter. So it's very simple. Just find us on social media. You can find us on Facebook at GSMC Book Review, Twitter and Instagram, GSMC_book review. So share, retweet, or comment depending on the social media platform, and you will be automatically entered into that drawing to win a free copy of Bridge Daughter. Good luck, and it's really good. You should definitely enter to win this book. Thank you again to my guest this week, Jim Nelson. Thank you to my listeners for tuning in for another fabulous author interview. I hope you will join me again on Tuesday when I will be interviewing author Debbie Burke about her book, The Devil's Instrument. She is a Montana author, so, she already holds a special place in my heart because that's my home state. So I'm looking forward to speaking with Debbie, and I hope you'll join me on Tuesday for that interview. In the meantime, you can find all of the GSMC Podcast Network podcasts at www.gsmcpodcast. You can download those podcasts on iTunes, SoundCloud, anywhere you listen to podcasts. You can find GSMC Podcast Network, and you can follow all of the podcasts and this book review podcast on social media. Don't forget, we also have a blog, and you can find all of Jim's information, his websites, and links on that blog, www.gsmcbookreview.blogspot.com. I never get that in one breath, do I? All this information is in the show notes, so you can look down there for the social media feeds and the blog feed, and then all of Jim's information will be in the blog article. Thank you so much for joining me. Now, stop listening to podcasts and go out there and get yourself lost in a good book. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.